They called the cops on an intruder, then realized he owned the neighborhood. The afternoon sun cast golden streaks over the gated community of Fairmont Ridge, a place where wealth meant exclusivity and strangers stood out. But as Morgan Freeman strolled through the quiet streets of his own neighborhood, a suspicious set of eyes followed him. Moments later, 911 was dialed, and just like that, everything changed. Does respect come from wealth or character? Comment 1 for character, 0 for wealth. Morgan Freeman had spent his life earning the respect of millions, not through status or power, but through wisdom, integrity, and presence. But today, in a neighborhood where he owned a multi-million-dollar home, he was nothing more than a stranger in the wrong place. It had been a simple afternoon. He had just returned from a trip and decided to take a walk around his new neighborhood, enjoying the crisp Colorado air. Clad in a comfortable sweater, slacks, and his signature hat, he looked like any other retiree enjoying a peaceful moment. But not everyone saw it that way. From the second-story window of a sprawling estate, Martha Williams, the longtime housekeeper of one of the wealthiest families in Fairmont Ridge, narrowed her eyes. A man, an unfamiliar man, tall, older, black, and worst of all, he wasn't in a luxury car or wearing designer clothes. To her, that could only mean one thing. Her fingers dialed 911 before she even took a second to think. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in the neighborhood. I don't know who he is, but he doesn't belong here. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't wait to see where he was going, because in her mind, she already knew. And now the police were on their way, to stop a man who had done nothing but take a walk in his own neighborhood. The quiet of Fairmont Ridge was undisturbed except for the rhythmic sound of Morgan Freeman's slow, measured footsteps along the paved sidewalk. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the neatly trimmed hedges lining the street. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. From the second-story window of a sprawling estate, Martha Williams, the longtime housekeeper of one of the wealthiest families in the neighborhood, stood with her arms crossed. She had lived in Fairmont Ridge for nearly 2 decades, not as a homeowner, but as someone who kept these homes pristine, who knew every resident by name. And she knew for a fact, she had never seen this man before. An older black man walking alone, dressed simply, too simply for Fairmont Ridge. He didn't belong. Her stomach tightened as she watched him stroll past the manicured hedges of the McAllister estate. What is he doing here? She murmured to herself. Her grip tightened on the phone in her hand. She had heard too many stories. Burglaries, vandalism, strangers casing houses, and she would not let that happen on her watch. Without hesitation, she dialed 911. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in the neighborhood. I don't know who he is, but he doesn't belong here. The dispatcher on the other end asked for details. Older male, black, walking alone, looking around like he's checking out the houses. A pause. No, he hasn't done anything, but he looks out of place. The dispatcher sighed but assured her that officers would be sent to check it out. Martha exhaled in relief. She had done her duty. She had protected the neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that she had just called the police on the owner of one of the very homes she thought she was protecting. Morgan continued his stroll, oblivious to the fact that he was now a suspect. His mind wandered, not to anything serious, just the simple thoughts of a man enjoying the fresh air. The silence was broken by a low hum. Then came the flashing red and blue lights. Morgan heard the police cruiser before he saw it. He turned as it pulled up beside him, tires crunching lightly against the pavement. 2 officers stepped out. One was young, tense, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. The other older, assessing, calculating. "Sir, can you stop right there for a moment?" The older officer, Sergeant Carter, said, his tone firm but professional. Morgan raised an eyebrow but complied, hands resting easily at his sides. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" Carter exchanged a glance with his partner before looking back at Morgan. "We received a report about a suspicious individual in the neighborhood. Do you live here?" Morgan inhaled slowly, processing the words carefully. He had been through this before, too many times. "I do," he answered simply. Carter's partner, Officer Reed, narrowed his eyes. "Can you prove that?" A flicker of something, not anger, but disappointment, passed through Morgan's eyes. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Inside was his driver's license, his address printed clearly beneath his name. Carter took the ID, glancing between it and Morgan's face. His lips parted slightly. Recognition dawned. "Wait, you're..." But before he could finish, the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps approached. And just like that, the situation changed again. Martha had stepped outside, her arms still crossed, her expression self-righteous. She looked straight at Carter. "I'm the one who called," she said. "I saw him walking around looking at houses. I've never seen him before." Morgan exhaled slowly, turning to face her fully. "That's interesting," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "Because I've owned a home here for 6 months." Martha's brows furrowed. "That's impossible," she scoffed. "I would know." Morgan let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "And yet you don't," he said simply. Carter, now fully aware of who he was dealing with, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Williams," he said carefully, "this gentleman owns the property at 714 Oakwood Drive." Martha froze. That address. That was the house on the corner, the estate she had admired just a few weeks ago. Her face paled. You own that house?" she whispered. Morgan met her gaze, unblinking. "I do." The weight of her mistake hit her like a freight train. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Carter handed Morgan his ID back, his expression carefully neutral. "Apologies for the misunderstanding, Mr. Freeman. You're free to go." Morgan took his ID, slipping it back into his wallet. "I was always free," he murmured. The silence that followed was deafening. But Martha wasn't the only one who had to answer for this, because someone else was about to find out exactly what she had done. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Martha Williams had spent years keeping the estate homes of Fairmont Ridge in perfect order, knowing every homeowner by name, or so she thought. But now she stood frozen in place, staring at the man she had just called the police on. The man who owned one of the grandest homes in the neighborhood, Morgan Freeman. She had unknowingly called the cops on Morgan Freeman, and now there was no way to take it back. Carter, the senior officer, shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice measured, "it appears there was a misunderstanding." Martha's lips parted, but no words came out. She was still processing. She had assumed a man walking in his own neighborhood didn't belong simply because she didn't recognize him. She swallowed hard, turning toward Morgan, her eyes filled with something between embarrassment and lingering disbelief. She started. Morgan held up a hand. "Don't," he said simply. Her mouth snapped shut. He wasn't angry, but his disappointment was heavier than anger ever could be, and somehow that was worse. Unbeknownst to them, the entire exchange had drawn attention. Across the street, a couple had stopped mid-walk, whispering to each other. A teenager peeked from behind a parked car, phone in hand, recording. And from one of the nearby balconies, James Harper, the estate manager, had witnessed the entire scene. The moment he recognized Morgan, he was already dialing his phone. Minutes later, the deep rumble of an approaching SUV filled the air. A sleek black Cadillac pulled up to the curb, and from it emerged a man in a tailored navy suit. James Harper. His usually calm face was tight with worry. The estate manager had handled enough crises to know when something had gone terribly wrong. And this was bad. He stepped forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Martha before shifting to Carter. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Before anyone could answer, he turned and faced Morgan, his expression softening. "Mr. Freeman, sir, I deeply apologize for whatever has happened here. I wasn't aware..." Morgan waved a dismissive hand. "That makes 2 of us," he murmured. James cleared his throat and turned toward Martha. "Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice sharper now, Would you like to explain to me why you called the police on one of our most respected homeowners? Martha flinched. I thought that he didn't belong. James finished for her. She looked away, because that was exactly what she had thought. James exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I think we're done here, officers, he said, his voice laced with authority. Carter nodded quickly, relieved to have an excuse to leave. Of course, Mr. Harper. Our apologies for the confusion. Morgan's gaze flicked toward him. It wasn't confusion, he said simply. Carter looked down, uncomfortable, before retreating toward his patrol car. Martha remained frozen, gripping her arms as if trying to make herself smaller. James turned to her, his expression unreadable. Pack your things, Martha. Her head snapped up. Wait, what? James didn't waver. You've worked here for years, and yet you made a call like this? You didn't even stop to ask a question? You put one of our most respected homeowners in handcuffs. They didn't handcuff me, Morgan interjected. James hesitated. Well, they might as well have. He turned back to Martha. You don't belong here anymore. Her eyes widened in horror. James, please, No, he interrupted, his voice firm. It's done. Martha's face drained of color. She had assumed she was protecting the neighborhood. Instead, she had exposed herself. She had spent years thinking she was part of this community. And now she was the outsider. Martha looked at Morgan one last time as if searching for something. Pity, forgiveness, an escape. But Morgan wasn't here to make her feel better. He was here to make her understand. Next time, he said, his voice low, before you call the police, ask yourself what you're really afraid of. Martha had no answer, because she already knew, and so did everyone watching. But Martha wasn't the only one who had to learn a lesson, because soon the entire neighborhood would know what she had done. Martha Williams walked away from the confrontation like a ghost, her once confident steps now uncertain, unsteady. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like an unbearable weight. She had spent years believing she was part of Fairmont Ridge, that her presence here was not just as an employee but as someone who belonged, someone who kept order. But now she was the one who had been cast out, and worse, the entire neighborhood was about to find out. Within hours, the news had begun spreading through Fairmont Ridge like wildfire. The estate's private online forum, normally filled with discussions about landscaping and HOA complaints, was now buzzing with something far more serious. Did you hear what happened with Morgan Freeman? Someone called the police on him. In his own neighborhood. Wait, you mean the Morgan Freeman? And then, the worst part. Someone had filmed it. A neighbor, likely one of the many who had been watching from their windows, had recorded the exact moment Morgan revealed that he owned a home in the neighborhood. The video wasn't just circulating in Fairmont Ridge, it had started leaking onto social media. It was only a matter of time before the world knew. That evening, as Morgan sat on his patio watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue, a knock sounded at his front door. He set down his book, exhaling slowly before standing. When he opened the door, James Harper stood there once again. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two members of the Fairmont Ridge HOA. One was a short, stocky man named Richard, the HOA president, who always spoke like he was running for office. The other a woman named Karen, ironically living up to her name. Morgan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. James, he greeted smoothly, nodding toward the others. I see you brought company. James cleared his throat. Mr. Freeman, But Richard stepped forward, interrupting. Mr. Freeman, I'd like to personally apologize on behalf of the Fairmont Ridge Homeowners Association. What happened today was an unfortunate misunderstanding, and we deeply regret any inconvenience caused. Morgan raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding, he repeated. That's an interesting way to describe it. Karen, standing stiffly beside Richard, forced a polite smile. We just want to ensure that Fairmont Ridge continues to be a welcoming and inclusive community, she said. Morgan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. A welcoming and inclusive community, he mused. Is that what you think this is? James shifted uncomfortably. Richard cleared his throat. Well, yes, and as a gesture of goodwill, the HOA would like to offer, but Morgan had already raised a hand. Let me save you the trouble, he said, his voice calm but firm. I don't want an apology just because this has become a scandal. Karen's smile faltered. Mr. Freeman, that's not, and I certainly don't need a PR-friendly gesture of goodwill, he continued. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. James, standing slightly behind them, rubbed a hand over his face. Because he knew. Morgan wasn't here for damage control. He was here for accountability. Morgan let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of their own words. Then he exhaled, tilting his head slightly. Tell me something, he said. What exactly is the HOA planning to do to prevent something like this from happening again? Karen blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Morgan's voice remained measured, controlled. What are you going to change? Richard shifted on his feet. Well, we hadn't exactly... Then let me make it easy for you, Morgan cut in. He stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority that had made him one of the most respected voices in the world. Because if you don't take action, I will. A beat of silence. Karen looked genuinely uneasy now. What do you mean? She asked. Morgan smiled faintly. Let's just say that if you don't make real changes to how this community operates, I have a very large platform that can bring national attention to what happened today. The unspoken message hung in the air. He didn't need to threaten them. They already knew what would happen if this became a major news story. Richard let out a shaky breath. All right, Mr. Freeman, what do you suggest? Morgan's smile didn't waver. We start with education, he said. Mandatory training for every resident and staff member in this neighborhood, bias training, racial sensitivity training, the works. And second, Richard asked hesitantly, a public acknowledgement, not just a quiet apology behind closed doors. The HOA needs to address what happened openly and transparently. Richard looked ready to argue, but then James spoke up. It's the right thing to do. Karen, still reluctant, glanced toward Richard. Richard sighed. Fine, he muttered. We'll make it happen. Morgan nodded once. Good. Then maybe this place can truly be a welcoming and inclusive community. By the next morning, a notice was posted on the Fairmont Ridge community website. The HOA had announced a new bias training program for all staff and homeowners. A public letter of apology was sent to every resident acknowledging what had happened. And Martha? She was gone. No one saw her again after that day. As for Morgan, he continued his peaceful walks through the neighborhood, except now whenever he passed a neighbor, they didn't just watch. They greeted him. They knew better now. But for some, the lesson had come far too late. Fairmont Ridge would never be the same after that day. The whispers faded, the online debates slowed, and eventually life returned to its usual quiet luxury. But something had shifted, an unspoken awareness that hadn't existed before. People had seen what happened. They had learned. Martha Williams, once a self-proclaimed protector of the neighborhood, had left in disgrace. Some said she moved to another town hoping to leave her mistake behind. Others believed she had finally faced the truth, that her fear had been the real trespasser that day. As for Morgan Freeman, he remained as he always had, steady, dignified, unshaken. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. He hadn't needed to demand justice. He had let the truth do the work for him. Weeks later, as he took another quiet walk through the neighborhood, a familiar figure approached. James Harper, the estate manager. Mr. Freeman, James said, clearing his throat, I just wanted to say thank you for how you handle things, for pushing us to be better. Morgan gave a small nod, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Change doesn't happen in silence, James, he said. It happens when people stop pretending everything is fine. James exhaled, nodding in agreement, and with that, Morgan continued his walk. No more flashing lights, no more suspicious stares, just peace. Because in the end, respect isn't about wealth, reputation, or status. It's about seeing people for who they truly are. And sometimes the biggest lessons don't come from those who shout the loudest, but from those who refuse to be ignored. Through this story, we realize that respect is not a privilege, it's a fundamental right. Morgan Freeman didn't demand recognition. He didn't retaliate with anger, he responded with dignity. And in doing so, he forced people to confront their own biases. This wasn't just about one mistaken phone call, it was about a mindset, a dangerous belief that some people belong and others do not. True worth isn't measured by what someone owns, but by how they treat those they assume are beneath them. Because the greatest test of character is not how we act when we feel powerful, but how we behave when we think no one is watching.